Last week we journeyed with the Israelites as they were escaping Egypt after their slavery. And what we saw with the Israelites was this very intense reaction when being in the desert, when being in this wilderness and getting hungry. They said they would rather that God had killed them as slaves in Egypt than to be where they are today. And last week we also saw how, even though this is a very intense reaction, that it's often the same kind of reaction we have to God. That there are times when our response may be silly or overdramatic even, just like the Israelites. And we see a similar situation in our readings this morning, particularly from 1 Kings, where Elijah, who's supposed to be the greatest prophet that Israel has ever seen, Elijah is there and saying to God that he wishes that God would end it for him, that God would take his life away, because he is no better than his ancestors. To understand where Elijah is coming from in 1 Kings today, it's helpful for us to see the path that he took that led him to where he is now. Elijah was a prophet in the time of King Ahab. And Ahab, we're told, is the most evil king that Israel has ever seen. And if that weren't enough, Ahab marries Queen Jezebel, who then comes in and to supplant the faith in our Lord, she helps establish the worship of the god Baal. And it's in this setting that Elijah finds himself the one last prophet of the Lord. And so he proposes a contest. He says that all the prophets of Baal, the many of them, should gather against him, the sole prophet of the Lord. They should each offer a sacrifice. And the one whose sacrifice is licked, that will declare whose God should be the God of Israel. And so the prophets of Baal lay out their sacrifice. And they cry and they wail and they raise their voices up to Baal, but it's to no avail. Nothing happens. Elijah, on the other hand, takes his sacrifice and pours jug and jug of water after water on it to make it even harder to light. And he cries to the Lord, and the Lord answers him, and the sacrifice is lit. And this makes the people realize that the Lord is the true God, that the Lord is the true God of Israel. And so the reign of the prophets of Baal is no more, and there seems to be hope that the worship of the Lord will return to Israel. However, Jezebel is not happy at what has happened. And so she sends a message to Elijah saying that if it's the last thing she does, she is going to hunt him down and kill him. Elijah's response is what I think it might be for many of us. He's scared. He's frightened. And so he runs away. This is where we find Elijah this morning. This is why he is in such despair. Because just when there was hope that faith in the Lord would be restored, just as he is on the curtails of his greatest victory as a prophet, all of a sudden it seems for naught. Because his life has been threatened. It seems that everything he did before isn't going to turn out the way he hoped for in service to God. We've all been where Elijah is. We've all struggled. And for many of us, our greatest failures may have come at what seemed, right after what seemed to be our greatest victories. Some of us may have had times where we felt the same despair that Elijah does, or even where we felt burned out. The interesting thing in Elijah's case is that God doesn't just let him quit. God does, though, give him time. This isn't the end of Elijah's work. God gives him a chance for rest. As we see in our reading today, God sends the angels to give Elijah what he needs for the journey. Because that journey is to Mount Horeb, to another famous scene in Elijah's ministry, where he goes up that mountain and where he hears God's voice in the sound of sheer silence. God basically sends Elijah out on a retreat. He gives him the opportunity to restore himself after the midst of this great stumble in his career. And God doesn't let Elijah just end things there. God gives Elijah some new tasks, but they're not monumental. What God assigns Elijah to do is to anoint 2 new kings and to train Elisha, who is to be Elijah's successor, and who is to gain double the portion of Elijah's own spirit. So while God doesn't give Elijah a huge backbreaking task, he does give him something to do. And what it is to prepare for the future, to prepare for what is to follow after him. All of us have times where we struggle and have hardships, just like Elijah. And that's why stories like Elijah's are so important for us, because they show that even in the midst of our troubles, God is still there. God was there for Elijah, even though he was ready to quit. And God didn't just let Elijah quit, but he did give him the opportunity to do something to prepare for the future, to prepare for the end. He gave him something that he could do, even in the midst of his sorrow, even in the midst of what seemed like failure to him. And if God will do this for the greatest of the prophets, God will do the same for us too. So when we're struggling, when we're burned out, when it seems like we've been knocked down, and when we don't want to get back up, we can know from Elijah's story that God is still there with us. And if we can keep moving forward, God will provide us what we need to continue. If we can live into what we heard in Ephesians, that spirit of love and forgiveness, then we can do the task that God has given us to do. Because God won't simply just let us quit, but God will give us what we need to move forward, even if all that is to prepare others to do that work for the future, to make that future bright with the glory of God, with that message of love, forgiveness, and hope that God calls on all of us to give.